Well, hello. So Chris Nichols here. It's the very first of the Project 65 About Time podcasts. And it is just about inevitable that the first person I would ask to be a guest on this is Philippa Hardman, because Philippa, you and I have worked together closely for very nearly 20 years. So welcome.
Thank you. And yes, it is inevitable that that I guess that we do the first podcast together of this is your series. And in fact, today is the very day when you turn 65. I nearly said
25.
25
You
then.
said 25. That's brilliant news. Thank you
You
for
don't
the
want to be,
gift of 4 decades.
you don't want to be 25 again. And in fact, actually, I know for a fact you don't want to be 25 again because we've talked about it and you got so much experience. And I'm just really delighted that you're doing this podcast series about time because I think it is about time that your voice was heard. I know for various reasons you have deliberately not put yourself forward over the last few years, but actually, over the 20 years that I've known you, you have been so generous in your ideas and your sharing of your knowledge and wisdom with others who then take and do things with those ideas. But I think it's a real shame that you haven't been heard more. So I'm really delighted you made this decision to do this podcast series. And I think that the title of it is really apt.
Thank you. I suppose for the last 10 years at least, and maybe longer, it has not been about me. I've been deliberate that it's not about me. And GameShift certainly is not about me. It's about creating a collaboration of people I think are fantastic and who the world needs to know about. And a lot of my work has been introducing good people to good people so that good stuff happens. But I do think there's some stuff I want to say, and there's also some stuff where I want to continue featuring the work of the people who've inspired me, because I stand on the shoulders of so many giants and I work alongside so many great folks. That's what this series is about. I suppose a starting point for both of us would be to talk about why we do what we do, because we are currently the co-founders of GameShift. But before that, we were the co-directors of the Ashridge practice, the Ashridge strategy practice. How would you describe the work we do?
Gosh, in lots of different ways. But I think the theme that's run through all of it is that it's all about participation, about including in a wider group of people into strategy or change, transformation. It's all about actually making something different happen on the ground. I mean, GameShift is so called because for a very clear reason that, we want to shift something. And I think also along the way, we've had a lot of fun. And I think actually our clients have had fun on a number of occasions as well. In fact, I think one client actually wrote that in a testimonial for us. Unfailingly useful and also surprisingly fun, I think, is the actual quote.
And I mean, I like that because uh, we very often do work around questions that intrinsically, are not necessarily fun. I mean, GameShift exists in support of human flourishing, and human flourishing happens in the face of what might loosely be termed these days a polycrisis. That barely a system, economic, social, climatic, environmental, almost every system on the face of the planet, whether it's a natural system or a human construct, is under stress. And our work is largely about helping people, really good people who run organizations, to think about those systemic changes and the implications of it for their leadership and their teams and their organizations in a way that allows them to see more of a system and get more creative responses. And that could be dry as old sticks. And it tends not to be, because of the participative nature of the work, which has a lot of energy, and also the artful knowing, the bringing in diverse ways of seeing and knowing, which is really at the heart of the work.
Podcast work. Sorry, can
Sure.
I ask you a
Yeah, yeah.
question?
Yes,
Podcast
of
where
course.
questions are allowed. Given the work that we've done, originally you came from a very different background in terms of your career. Civil service, fast stream, then into PwC, leading the energy practice globally, then moving to New York and due to PwC merger becoming director of an investment bank, and then moving to Ashridge. I guess dry as dust might be some of the things you say you might have done in the past. I do know, but I would really like you to talk a bit about what has the journey to really becoming interested in participative ways of working.
I've always been interested in participative ways of working. Sometimes I've done work where my very way of being in the world hasn't been legitimate, hasn't been allowed. Part of my growing up was learning that I couldn't ignore my energy just to do high status, high money jobs that didn't suit me. So in my 30s and yeah, probably in my 30s, really, I hung out my shingle in service of a blue suit and global corporate finance and went all over the world pretending to be an investment banker. But I was just not suited to it. I mean, it wasn't that I wasn't any good at it, but I wasn't inclined towards it. It didn't light any fires. So I'm delighted I did it. I met some great people. I had some experiences that were unbelievably interesting, but it wasn't for me. The work I did at Ashridge and the work we've done in GameShift is soul work. I mean, it's not about money. It's about the people we work with and the issues we address and the way we work with them. And it's fun.
I was just smiling because I was thinking as the commercial side of Ashridge from GameShift, then actually I would say there is an element that is about money. But I do take your point. And I think also some of the things that I have seen you do and we have done together, interestingly, I'm not sure that you would have been given permission by the client to do it or the space by a client organization to do it if you didn't come from that I'm an ex-PwC partner, I'm an ex-investment banker. It gives you a credibility in the boardroom that I think also allows you to perhaps go more left field than otherwise they might become.
Yeah. I generally don't say those things, though. It may be that they're known about me, but I think I carry a certain gravitas because of the things I've done. I was very lucky as a absolute, youngster in the civil service to be chief bag carrier for Sir Peter Gregson, who was like the Sir Humphrey of the Department of Energy in those days. Because I was working for Peter Gregson, I went to all kinds of meetings about the Piper Alpha disaster with heads of the oil company concerned, privatization meetings where the heads of National Power and Powergen and the CGB and the Electricity Council, they were all coming in and talking to ministers about what to do next. And it's such a privileged position to see that sort of thing close up. And yeah, I was lucky. I applied for that job, you know, because it looked interesting, and I got into energy, and energy suited me. My first ever job, I mean, it's 45 years ago now, or almost 43 years ago now, um, was in energy conservation. And energy conservation and sustainability has come back and come back and come back right through my life. And I'm still interested in energy. I'm talking to people in Cornwall now about sustainable energy projects from, offshore wind to geothermal. And it goes back to my roots. My first job in the Department of Energy oversaw the budget for the Camborne School of Mines Hot Rocks project. The same thing, 40 odd years on. It's just been an astonishing privilege.
Yeah, and it's come, well, not full circle, but it's amazing how much of a thread that has been going throughout, which I think a lot of people don't really know about, actually.
Well, do you know? No, I suppose to some extent I've been around so long, it's not worth talking about what I've done in some ways because it sounds like I might be making it up, but I'm not. It's just I've had several careers, all for about 10 years. So 10 years in government, 10 years in Pricewaterhouse, 10 years or more in Ashridge, and 10 years in GameShift. Yeah, but I'm glad you mentioned circles because circles are also at the heart of everything for me. Everything comes full circle. That's the point. You reach a stage where, and it's T.S. Eliot line, isn't it? You arrive back at the beginning and see the place for the first time. You arrive back at the place you started. And the cyclical nature of the water cycle or the rock cycle the whole cycle of life pervades everything I do. And retrospectively, I can see it in everything I've done. But it also is central to the whole idea of action research and action inquiry, which, of course, is what we work with. These cycles of trying stuff in conditions of uncertainty when nobody knows the answer. And lots of stuff we work with, there is no answer. There is no expert. So you do these cycles and, good stuff happens because of it. And there's a rigor to that.
And I think one of the things I notice with clients increasingly is that using the word experiment allows a client, whether it be an individual, a team, or an organization, to feel okay about trying something in a way that even piloting or trialing, it doesn't sound quite as, if you like, informal, without lots of paperwork to give the approval to do a pilot or something like that. And I've often seen people go, oh yeah, I can do an experiment. Whereas if you said, do you want to pilot it? It has a sense of there needs to be a team of people and it needs to be signed off and paperwork and this kind of thing. And I think that idea of experimentation and trying stuff out, even if you never mention the words action inquiry, and I know that, you can quote chapter and verse on it, but that actually we use the terms very rarely. But actually the whole underpinning ethos of trying something, reflecting on it, seeing what you're learning from it, and either doing something different or continuing to do more of it, I think is really helpful, particularly at times like now when people are feeling so very much out of control of so many things, whether it's in their organization or obviously, more widely.
We're always experimenting. We're always exploring. And what else is there to do? You will literally, when you go out of the door, there's nothing else to do but explore and conduct an experiment, because the idea that you know what's going to happen is completely fanciful.
Yes, yeah. And I
We
think
don't know.
actually, I suspect that experiment is going to be taken as a word in due course and will become used for something else in many respects. When you and I first talked about engagement around strategy engagement, this idea of bringing people into a strategy process rather than simply the consultants or the exec team, but opening it up. People had never heard of that. It was something that, and I know Richard Whittington, amongst others, was talking about the concept of it, but that in terms of in practice, I think we were amongst the first people, perhaps first people to use it. But now I notice that the word itself of engagement now is quite often used to mean kind of super duper comms. And comms is obviously important, but it is different to what we were talking about.
Yeah, we can't control language. We can't control what other people do with ideas and models and perspectives. And the world's a big place. There's room. But I think there is something about live work that really matters. If these things get codified to the point where the meaning of the word becomes too small for the job, people at the living edge of the work will always invent a word that's alive to convey the living work, because
Yes.
organizations need connected humans doing living work in an uncertain world. And when you're doing live work, and when the work is formulaic and dead, and people notice the difference. And that's why they seek us out. They seek us out when they want to do living work.
Yeah, no, and you can feel the energy. And when people experiment with things, and I know we've had situations where we've been working, for example, with 200, 300 people in a room. And actually, we've done an experiment ourselves with, the work that's going on in the room. And out of that, 2 new products have been created simply by helping people come together and have the conversations, different conversations to the one that they might normally have in the everyday, workspace.
Well, let's talk about, why does it matter to you? I mean, what do you love about the work that you do?
I think, well, I'm going to talk about the work we do, as in Game Shift, and I think also the work that you and I have done before Game Shift as well. And I think in all of it, the thing that brings me alive is seeing people do something different, is actually trying something out, experimenting with something, recognizing that people have ideas and it's not necessarily restricted to the top group. I remember one of a client's proudest moments was during a strategy process where they had invited everyone in the organization, about 1,500 people. They had invited everybody to a conference to, as they described it, to share ideas about what was going to happen, what the organization should do as it sought to reinvent itself moving forwards. And I remember the CEO was so proud because 2 cleaners had responded to say, actually, they wanted to come and contribute. And they participated just as fully as anybody else did. And I think that idea, and I'm not saying that in every organization that's the same at all, but that idea of teasing open, moving away from the usual suspects, because earlier in my career, when I was at PwC, not with you, but I remember doing a lot of strategy work where it was very desk-based research. We would do it in the office. Several times we worked through the night to get things finished, to put in a report, to take to the client. And I remember one particular telecoms company, we went to present the findings. We presented it, all went very well. And I remember the partner in the lift on the way back downstairs to leave afterwards said, well, that went very well. I hope we'll get the implementation work. And there was that complete separation of strategy and implementation. The consultants had done the strategy. The organization, in fact, we weren't invited to do the implementation. I think they just did it themselves. The organization then took what we'd said and may have taken some of it on board and may have ignored the rest of it. And one of the things that I remember resonating really clearly with me, that when you and I started talking together was such an antidote to that, was 2 things. One, this separation between strategy and implementation, or coming up with the ideas and making something happen on the ground. And the second thing was that we had produced this beautiful report that was probably about that thick, that I imagine is probably still sitting on a desk somewhere, 25 years later, or being used as a doorstop, because I think so many of these things like strategy documents end up just being completely, as you say, dead documents. And what I like about the work we've done is, and the conversations that led to it were about actually how do we bring these things together? How do we bring creating the ideas for the future? How can we do it that we get the best ideas possible, involve more people? But also, how do we do it such that there's not this separation, this hard stop between doing the strategy and implementing it? And I think you and I have talked about quite a lot about the process of strategizing, that it being an interwoven process, and there are no firm lines between where one stops and the other starts.
As you're speaking, there's so many roots and contributions that I'm going, oh yeah, and that's because, oh yeah, that's because. And there's everything in there from Gary Hamel, for goodness sake, in his work way, way back on strategy and core competencies of the firm and strategic architecture, where he said, the dirty little secret of strategy is that no one actually admits how it gets created. And alongside that was Henry Mintzberg's work on emergent strategy, where, strategy grows like weeds. It's not cultivated like a beautiful exhibition tomato. Because sometimes it's both of those things. You can do really deliberate work and come up with a really good piece of analysis and a good intention, and still the thing that happens in the world is not that. Strategy is when you take an intention into the world and it meets the messy reality, and it only comes alive if people live it. And the whole point of what we do and others like us is work with the messy reality of organizations so that people develop the strategy together, they own it because they've created it, and they live it. So when you're out trying to meet a customer and you notice something unusual that's happening, you know that it's strategically important, and it comes back in cycle, and feeds a better version of the strategy, which moves all the time. And the moment these things become fossilized into reports or plans, they're always dead. It doesn't mean the report or the plan's not useful, because you may need it for the bank or you may need it for governance purposes, but just don't confuse it with the real thing. The real thing is the living strategy in a changing world. And GameShift has always been about bringing a diverse set of people to work with organizations in all kinds of different ways, from engineers to psychotherapists, from musicians to voice coaches and body workers and all kinds of things, because the language that you bring and the lenses that you bring have to be big enough to stand a fighting chance of seeing different facets of the complexity. Otherwise, you can't even see it. And where my old Price Waterhouse, blue suit comes in on this is it's risk management. If you can't see through a diverse enough sense of lenses, to see more of the situation, you're not actually making a strategy. You're not actually looking after the risks because you're blind to everything except the logical and the analytic. And that's too small. It's like David White said, it's got to be big enough to be alive.
And I think actually, as you're describing it, it's making me think that you're probably one of the people I know who, if not the person I know, who thinks so systemically. And I think it allows you to see those different patterns and connections really easily. And I know you say this is what you've always done, but actually I suspect because it's so innate to how you are, you don't actually realize what a powerful thing it is and how few people and organizations actually are able to do that. And in a way that is so helpful for people to be able to realize, and sometimes a bit frightening as well, to realize that everything is connected. But again, coming back then to that idea of experimenting, helping people to experiment with things. If everything's connected, but you're going to do an experiment and see what happens, well, actually, I can do that. That's, and I know clients really value your ability to see things so widely. I'm being particularly nice to you, by the way, because it's your birthday.
I've always been very curious about stuff. Yeah, and I've been interested in different things, and I connect, and they just automatically connect. I mean, my daughter-in-law, who's a doctor, just describes me as fundamentally miswired. But there's an advantage in being fundamentally miswired at times. But I also think it's a kind of neurodivergence. But it's a helpful. And I have a memory like a sponge, which
has
also
caused me
helps.
some grief at times. Yeah, you definitely have a memory like a sponge. And I think one of the things actually that is really beautiful about the memory is that I have seen you with large groups, with boards, at times suddenly quote some lines from a poem to them. And I think you take it very much for granted because you do have such a memory like a sponge, whereas, most of us don't. But I think that helps to bring a different feeling to the conversation, actually. You bring in all those different perspectives and techniques in a way, really, and you hold them really lightly.
Yeah. Well, and, the reason it works is everybody knows that matters. People do love it because it's alive and it's a dimension of our rich humanness that often doesn't get a fair outing in organization. When I think of the people who've inspired me, like David White or Martin Shaw, Jeff Mead, the people from whom poetry and story just runs through them. The reason people love their work is it's deeply juicy and alive. And when we bring little bits of that here and there into our work, I don't hang up my shingle as a storyteller, but we use story all the time. I don't air myself abroad as a poet, but we use poetry all the time. And the same with art. And because it's alive, and because people love things that are alive, it works. And the world is better because they then do it. When we were working with that large engineering company and we had Doug Shaw, he was invited to come with some of his colleagues and do an enormous graphic reporting wall, which is semi-traditional. He also did something that was absolutely not traditional and unexpected. We didn't know he was going to do it, and it was brilliant, was to set up some canvases and start painting the meeting as an abstract painting. And that was pivotal because, first of all, we didn't know what he was doing. Secondly, none of the 200 or 300 people in the room knew what he was doing, and they came over. And he just told them how he was feeling the energy of the room and representing it as abstract colour, and people just joined in. And
Yes.
we ended up with a series of live co-created abstract paintings reflecting the energy of a meeting. And they ended up on the walls of this organisation's HQ in Paris, which was absolutely brilliant.
And they still talk about it. I think they still talk about it. And I remember really clearly the sort of the first and the last. I think he produced 4 or 5 of them. But the first one basically just had, with the company colours, just blocks of vertical lines. Just 4 blocks or so of vertical lines with the different colours from the corporate branding. And over the course of the 3 days of this coming together of 200 or 300 people working together, it evolved such that by the end it was much more like a Catherine wheel with all the colours intermingled and some other sort of sharp splodges of colour. I might be talking about circles. Well spotted, well spotted. And for him, it was, I remember him saying, the energy had been very much about everybody in their silos, and everybody was talking about, we and you. Whereas by the end, they were talking about we, meaning us, the 200 to 300 people in the room and their teams across this huge division of this very enormous company. And that was such a transformation in terms of how they had started to work together. So they were thinking about some strategic aims and intentions, but they were also, just by the way they were working together, starting to put it into practice, having different conversations, being curious about different things.
So what have we learned about working together to allow stuff like this to happen? And maybe that's one question, or maybe another question is, what's your favourite bit of it? What have you learned?
You were going to say, what have we learned about working together? And my response was going to be that we should never, ever write a book together again, which I think we are agreed on.
No more books, no.
Yeah, we have written one, Disrupted, we should say the name, and it seems to have been well received. But definitely, I think creative tensions, as we were writing.
Our writing coach said it was, yes, creative tension taken to a new level. Yeah.
So what was your question again? It was about what we've learned.
It was either about what have we learned that we can take into the future of our work, or maybe it's just about what's the juicy edge.
Okay.
Where are you now?
I think I am increasingly, going back to that word experiment, I notice I am using it more and more in ways that I didn't even 4 years ago. So for me, there is something about getting people doing things, because I see so many organizations who are paralyzed by either fear of doing something or by concerns about will it be the right thing to do. And I was just thinking actually about you talking about being in a suit, and I'm just comparing it to now. So I never knew you when you wore a suit and tie every day, and I know when we first met, I had some views on how you turned up at work, and now you turn up beautifully in a collared shirt thanks to my intervention. Thank you. But what I notice is you're casual, but you are absolutely there. You are doing the work. And so in some respects, I suppose the edge is moving from that everything being formalized to everything being potentially informal, but working in that space. I think we're becoming increasingly interested in what work happens in the informal space in organizations, because our sense is that not very much. Well, yeah, lots of happening, really, but it's not taken advantage of and used.
Yeah. Actually, it's really interesting that you raised that about the clothing, because it makes me think about, first of all, I was going to say to you, well, actually, some of my best work, it wouldn't have mattered if I came in a bin bag. I could still have done the work. And I remember I used to do some work at the Royal Defence College, and the commandant used to actually apologise for me, because all these extremely sharply dressed officers wondered who was this guy in a donkey jacket and T-shirt arriving on their stage. And then I used to get off the stage and wander around and talk to them. And they had me back year after year, because I think I was such a point of difference. But they said, could I please stay on the stage, because I was frightening the officers, which was always quite funny. But the thing for me is, I think there used to be something performative in dressing down to do the work. I used to facilitate some of the work barefoot, which I don't do and I haven't done for 10 years. And I think there was something performative and gestural in doing that I no longer need to do. I can be as grounded and as provocative with my shoes on as my shoes off. I can be
general relief to us all.
Well, yeah, well, exactly. But the point is, I had to learn to do that. There was a stage of going through being more shamanic, being more deeply ecological, and performing a role of looking like that enabled me to find my own way of being it. And I couldn't take time out while I found that. I did it live with clients. Bless them for tolerating me. But there was always a learning edge. And I think that's part of being alive. If you're working live with your learning edge with your clients, the work is more alive, but obviously it is risky for
Yes.
everybody. And
Yes.
people have to trust that it's not out of control. And I think one of the things that's been fortunate and we've had a gift for together is our clients have had confidence that the work is held even where it's been very edgy. And we do sometimes talk about being a Trojan mice or bringing Trojan mice together, looking more formal to do very provocative work. And there is something in there that's been incredibly blessed and powerful. What's next? I mean,
Well, I was going to,
we
you've
should
got to
finish
answer the
quite
question
soon.
too, though, so
Yeah.
what have you learned? What is the edge, the frontier for you?
Well, I suppose I was talking about what I've learned, but the edge for me now, I want to take art and curating more seriously. So one of the reasons I'm doing this series is to look at the threads of all these conversations with people I've worked with and people who've influenced me and people who've inspired me, clients, co-facilitators, writers, and then do some reflection on that. I mean, this too is a cycle of inquiry. This too is a series of gestures which will have a response. And when we see the response, we'll understand the gesture. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
no.
there's a cycle in there. And, I owe that to the wonderful Bill Critchley and Hugh Pidgeon, to whom I owe so much of where my work comes from. And of course, the deeper roots are where their work came from too. So I want to
Yes.
honour all of that in this series.
And you haven't mentioned, of course, the wonderful Chris Seeley.
No. Well, she, of course, is one person who sadly
Can't be.
can't. Yeah. But I have got some film of Chris, which we made a couple of days before she became unconscious with her brain tumor. And I'm planning to get some of those film clips and some of the people whose life Chris touched to put together a special, which will be the place of Chris Seeley, who I worked with well over a decade. Well, again, a very formative decade. And I want to make sure that we find a way to honour that, even though she can't be here, because she is here in so many ways.
And you refer to her a lot. I mean,
Not just
I
me.
didn't work directly with the two of you, but you do. I know how much she influenced you because you do refer to
Oh,
her
yeah.
a lot.
Yeah, we created all kinds of, we ran a master's degree together for 10 years. We taught at Schumacher together for years. We wrote stuff together. We invented a lot of what we currently, as in a Game Shift, currently does as artful knowing. A lot of the early work of that was Seeley Nichols at Schumacher and elsewhere, where we were playing with a particular frontier.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what's the thing
Philippa,
you're Oh, sorry.
I'm very conscious that it's 37 minutes and we shouldn't take too much of people's time. Say your question.
No, and in fact, I'm quite conscious that I've got a dog started barking in the background. So apologies to any listeners for noises. And I was also just reflecting that this feels quite different for us as a conversation because actually I think I probably interrupt you more often in real life than I do. You need to put headphones on me more often and I shall be more formal and not interrupt you. This might be the secret, something you should have learned 20 years ago. But what's the thing you're proudest of that we've done together?
We've kept it alive. Apart from anything else, Game Shift has continued some work that the world continually tries to shut down. I have watched the master's degree I used to run get shut down. It was shut down at the University of Bath and then it was shut down at Ashridge. I've worked with Schumacher College, which has gone. I've worked at Findhorn, which has gone. So much of the juicy edged work which challenges the paradigm is shut down again and again. And we have managed to create in Game Shift a Financial Times listed management consultancy that's been on the FT listing 8 years in a row, doing work that the world continually tries to shut down. And I'm proud as hell of that because it matters. And I don't care if other people start doing it. In fact, I want millions of people to start doing it because that's the point. Because otherwise, the world gets smaller and smaller at exactly the time when we need our capacity to understand systemically and connectedly and see the cycles of the living world alive in the corporate world. We need that. And without it, there is no solution. So I'm proud of that. And I'm proud that we've been able to do that together, because it's been a great partnership, and long may it continue. I'm not planning that it stops just because I'm a bit older now. You know, there are plenty of the Marvs and the Sandras and all those other great duos in the OD world. And I hope we continue to be one for a long time to come.
The Hardman-Nichols partnership continues. It's
Philippa
been a
Hardman,
blast.
thank you very much for being on this one. I'm sure you'll be back on a future one. There'll be a lot more to talk about.
I'll hold you to it.
Thank you.
I'll interrupt
Bye-bye.
you more. It's been great. I've enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.